cores, 4 threads and the named Core i3, something quite common in the budget segment of CPUs. At least until Intel decided to change that with the 8th generation of Intel CPUs. If you didn't have enough money to buy a proper i5 with proper 4 cores, you could get one of these, a 4th gen Core i3 for the socket LGA1150. At the time of release, 2 cores with 4 threads were quite viable for a budget gamer. Nowadays, it seems kind of weak, but is that actually true? I decided to check that out with some of the latest and greatest titles, put up against one of the strongest Core i3s from the 4th generation of Intel CPUs. For benchmarking purposes, I will be using the RX 570, not really an ideal candidate to get the most out of the i3 CPU. As you will see, it will be good enough to point out some of the main weaknesses of the older generation of i3 CPUs. So now, without wasting any more time, let's get straight to the benchmarks. First up is the very CPU-intensive Mafia Remake. And as it is usually the case with an i3, you can expect almost 100% of CPU usage almost all of the time, with frame times all over the place. But to be honest, this doesn't feel that bad like a 2nd gen i3 for example. Usually when using a higher end CPU, you will get around 45 to 50 FPS with the RX 570. But here, the averages are around 35 FPS. The percentile figure is not that great. And of course, as it is a CPU with only 2 physical cores, you can expect stutters from time to time. Nevertheless, the results aren't that terrible. But honestly, they are in the range of what you can expect from an i3 CPU with 2 cores and 4 threads. It seemed like AC Valhalla would perform quite nicely on the i3, until we reached a point where the game froze, something that can honestly happen quite often with dual-core CPUs. Yes, the hyperthreading does help out, but as you can see, it cannot eliminate all the stutters and freezes. The i3 4170 almost allows the RX 570 to reach its full potential. Despite the good average figures, the percentile figures really tell the full story. In another Ubisoft title, namely Far Cry 6, we can see the CPU usage hovering at around 90% almost all of the time, with some quite apparent stutters while running the benchmarks. From my experience, when using a stronger CPU you can expect around 50 to 60 FPS on the same settings with the RX 570. So the i3 isn't that bad in my opinion. I was honestly surprised that the game ran this well. I was expecting much worse. Another quite intensive title on the CPU side of things is Elden Ring, which is perfectly playable on the RX 570 even at the maximum settings, but of course, with a stronger CPU. Using the i3 4170 you can see drops even under 30 FPS when the action heats up, something that's quite common in this game at using a dual-core CPU with hyperthreading. This happens on almost all the i3s that have 2 cores and 4 threads, but to be honest, as I have tested a 2nd gen i3 in this game as well, this CPU performs much better. And I can even call this quite playable in my opinion. The very recently released Dying Light 2 runs almost perfectly on the i3 4170, the RX 570 almost being able to be utilized at a full potential, offering almost a solid 40 FPS experience. Of course that can change while moving later to the game, but for now it seems quite good. As you can see, there are also some stutters present in the 0.1 percentile figures, but by now, it's not really surprising with the i3. From my experience, in Dirt Rally 2, even a dual-core CPU is enough to play the game at high settings, as long as the GPU is good enough like the RX 570, with the i3 4170 being no exception to that. Shown with the average figures, the game runs almost perfectly even on dual-core CPUs. I did notice that in Doom Eternal, whenever I'm using a dual-core CPU with 4 threads, I get an average frame rate of around 50 FPS. Same thing happened with the 2nd gen i3. Of course, the RX 570 can deliver much better frame rates, going into the 80s and offering an average of 80 FPS on the 11th gen Core i5. So needless to say, the Core i3 4170 isn't really the best CPU for this game. Going back to a time when the CPU was freshly released, in The Witcher 3, running it on the maximum preset with medium post-processing, we are getting averages of around 50 FPS, but as seen from the footage, you can experience quite a lot of stuttering where there is quite a lot of action going on screen. So not really the most perfect experience in my opinion. From my experience, to run The Witcher 3 without many stutters, you need a proper quad-core CPU. So the i3-4170 isn't really that bad, but honestly these results are kind of expected, knowing that only 2 physical cores can't really handle the most modern titles. Honestly, I would not recommend to buy the i3-4170 or any i3 from the 4th generation to be exact. You will be much better off buying an Core i5 from the same generation, and pairing it with something like the RX 570 or 580 and have much better performance in 1080p gaming, eliminating most of the stutters. As for the use case of an i3 from the 4th generation in 2022, I can see someone pairing it with an RX 560 for example, and playing the most popular esports titles like CSGO or Valorant for example. And considering that the whole combo of motherboard and CPU cost me only $40, this isn't really a bad buy. But as you saw back in the benchmarks, you can't really expect it to handle the most demanding AAA titles of recent times.